think the best advice is the same advice that I think that's been given a lot is that that children have been essentially indoctrinated into a cult, like a us-them mentality with the alienating parent. And because of that, it makes them not receptive to really anything anybody outside will say or do. And so it's nothing, sadly, there's nothing you can do. You didn't do anything wrong. You didn't make this happen. Even if, nobody's perfect. So even if you've made mistakes, unfortunately, the abusive parent is fantastic, exacerbating those mistakes to hide their own abuse. And in my talk tomorrow, I'll talk a lot about this, about how we can't keep focusing on what everybody's doing and focus in on what is the primary cause of what's happening. Because everybody likes to cast aspersions. They like to throw smoke and say, look, everybody's at fault here. Let's stop pointing fingers. Well, we don't do that for other kinds of domestic violence when there's a coercively controlling, abusive person. We used to blame victims, but we don't do that anymore. We say that's a victim and this person's abusive. We need to do something about it. But that's what you're dealing with. It's kind of like we've gone back in time and erased gender because we don't find gender differences in this. So it just means that you sadly are a target of a coercively controlling, abusive dynamic. And the other person has gotten control of the narrative, but there's nothing you did wrong per se. Usually the parents who do this at such a high level have a lot of pathology and you can't fix them. So sadly, there's sort of a double-edged sword about this, right? You're not responsible for it, so you can relieve yourself of a lot of guilt about it. But at the same time, it doesn't fix the problem because the problem needs to be addressed at a larger societal level. Well, since I started doing research in this field, there wasn't a discussion about it being family violence. There was a lot of discussion about it being child abuse. And so I knew it was bigger than that. The children are the victims, the unintended victims of this. And the focus was always on the child. And I get it. Obviously, you want to protect children, but that won't solve the problem. You have to look at the behaviors that are causing what's happening. And so when I started doing research in this area, that was my main focus. And it was interesting to see over the last 12, 13 years, how changing the narrative on that and refocusing it to focusing more on what the parents are doing to make this happen, that's when everything blew up. And the advocates and the extreme advocates of the domestic violence movement did not like that because it's saying that moms and dads could be abusive parents. Whereas historically, these advocacy groups have focused the narrative on being women as victims. And if they're doing these behaviors, they must be doing it to protect the parent. But yet they're excusing abusive behaviors, to protect their child. They must be doing that to protect the child from the other parent. But men are also victims of it too. And so that's incompatible with the ideology that a lot of the extreme advocates have. I'm not saying all advocates. I mean, I've always been a domestic violence advocate because I believe that it's not okay for anybody to be a victim of any kind of abuse. But I've been told I'm not a feminist just because I study this and a lot of other ad hominem attacks, even though I'm a women's studies major. I'm as strong of a feminist as you can get. But these are not your normal feminists. Their brand of feminism is arguing for the status quo, that women should be victims and women should be dependent. And I don't believe that. I believe women and men should be equal. But yet they're constantly arguing for the status quo and not wanting to change what's happening. Because women are listened to more when they make allegations of abuse than men. If men make an allegation of abuse, they must be making it up or exaggerating. And so that's what we're dealing with now is a lot of old stereotypes and ideologies. And that's what's blocking progress. Well, I don't know. There's a lot of opinions I could probably throw out there about what I think is the motive behind why people are attacking others who are speaking up about this. I don't know if I have a good answer about why. I don't like to put words in other people's mouths, but I think, a lot of it comes to defending a worldview. They have a perspective on it and they feel it's under attack when it's challenged, especially as more and more research is being published that directly contradicts a lot of the arguments that are made. What I'm finding now more and more is a few years ago, the critics of parental alienation scholarship focused on, this must be pseudoscience or it's junk science or the research on this isn't high quality. Well, we've proven that to be untrue, right? A couple of years ago, I published the largest review of all research and we found over 200 peer-reviewed studies with data. And that was through 2020. 5 years have gone by and I've published at least 5 this year alone. And there's a lot of other research coming out, like just a new longitudinal study came out of China last week. So, I mean, there's a lot of new research that directly contradicts a lot of the arguments that are being made by critics. My graduate student, Josh Marsden, just published a review evaluating the quality of research on parental alienation. And he's going to speak on that here at the conference. He found the research has always been high quality. So their arguments to try to undermine the research that undermines their opinions are failing, because at every turn we are proving that those arguments are wrong. But rather than look at it with an open mind, they immediately just either dismiss it, try to undermine it. But it's getting harder to do the more this work piles up. So what I'm seeing now is more of a flat out pretending it's not there, not citing it, not mentioning it. When I read articles, I'm often asked to review articles that are being considered for publication. And I've reviewed some written by critics of alienation. And I took it as an opportunity to give them a good talking to through my comments and feedback, picking apart every single argument that they made and say, where's your empirical support for this argument? Where's your argument? What's the theoretical rationale for that argument? I haven't seen them be able to publish it anywhere after I completely ripped them a new one. But when you try to pick apart and you look at the arguments they're making, I'm like, there is no foundation for any of the statements that some of these critics are writing about. And so I feel like, and then they amazingly exclude all this research that's being done on alienation or parental alienation. They don't even mention it. So, or they cite work that was done 10 years ago. So clearly they're not staying up to date on what's being published, and it's willful ignorance, in my opinion, because they're protecting a worldview that is falling apart. And as a consequence of that, they're on the attack more because they're like cornered. I think, if anything, they're kind of like cornered animals. I don't know why it's so hard to believe, because we don't disbelieve that a normal, healthy person could get indoctrinated into a cult. An adult can get indoctrinated. Here you have children, years of research on child suggestibility, vulnerabilities. Parents can influence their children in so many domains. I'm going to talk about this in my talk tomorrow, but parental influence is huge. Parents influence their children's attitudes towards foods, towards exercise, towards outgroup behaviors, towards divorce, politics, anything you could name. Parents influence it either directly or children observe them and their behaviors towards others, how they interact with other people, how they speak to their friends about other people. Children absorb that. They're the role models for the children. And so how can you say that that the parent has no ability to influence their attitudes about the other parent? Parents can influence their attitudes about cousins and grandparents all the time. Nobody questions that. And that's healthy children. Imagine you have a child who's traumatized by the separation of their parents. And then they come to believe, because of the influence, that the one that's not there never loved them. And that parent is not involved a lot because of gatekeeping behaviors and other things. So they don't have any outside kind of experiences with that other parent to counteract and combat the narrative, the false narrative that's being told to them. You got critics say that it's not possible unless the other parent had some good reason to do it. Well, if they're being told all sorts of things that are not true or gaslit about things that the parent is doing, exaggerate, making it appear something that it's not, then of course the child is going to start to believe that, because that's the only parent they feel they have left. So the abusive parent, who they sadly believe is a victim, even though they're doing all these things themselves, they side with that person, like Stockholm syndrome, essentially. And they reject everybody else and they have to, because it's a defensive position to be in. They have to protect their abuser because that's the only parent they have left. They have to cling to that because that's the only lifeline they feel like they have. They don't believe the other parent ever loved them, abandoned them, unsafe, unfit, whatever it is that the parent has influenced them to believe. And so they don't want to have anything to do with them because they feel too hurt by it and they cannot grieve it. And if they can't grieve it, it's too terrifying to even interact with that parent because they're so hurt by it and they're angry, and yet it's all under the surface. So I think for targeted parents, when you see your kids yelling at you, screaming at you, destroying property, refusing to talk to you, it's nothing to do with you. This has to do with the child being so hurt because they believe this about you. And that's where it's so tragic, because as a parent, you can't do anything to change that perception, nothing, because the child is not receptive to it. The only way you can get them to be receptive to it is usually, hopefully, when they get out of the orbit of that influencing parent. Because when they're in their orbit and under their control, they won't hear you. They won't see you. Unfortunately, you hope that maybe the child has some boundaries and can start to resist some of it, but not all children do. And not all children do become alienated. We know that. Nobody's ever said that alienating behaviors always cause alienation. Critics like to say that that's what we think, but we have never thought that. I think when you have unresolved trauma, you're going to have, for a large swath of the population, you're going to have major problems. These children have learned to just cut things off if it becomes too difficult or too painful. They don't learn how to work things out. They don't learn how to consider alternate perceptions and perspectives on things. They become very black and white in their thinking, and so they don't ever develop that kind of critical thinking that you need to be a functional adult. It's going to make it very difficult for them to function. And what we see in polarization at the US politic level, for example, there's extreme polarization where people don't listen to out-group members. They only listen to their own in-group at this point. That's going to get worse because that's the MO of how people who've been traumatized in this way operate.
Is they cut off, isolate, divide. They don't tolerate, cooperate, collaborate.
Yeah.
Right.
And if anybody starts to then challenge them or be critical of their opinions, they will cut them off. And I think it's even worse it's a combination. I think we see it sometimes a little bit, and this is my opinion. I think it might be a little bit worse in some individualistic countries like the United States, Australia, Canada, Europe, because there's so much focus on, I could do this myself and I don't need anybody. And I don't think that is shared in other cultures as often. There's more of a community focus. And so I think you have to learn how to get along with other people. And when you have a culture that values individuality, and the child or person could just say, you know what, I can choose my friends, I can choose my family, then there's no incentive to have to work it out. There's no incentive to have to try to push through the hard things and still maintain a healthy relationship with somebody. Even if you don't agree on everything, you can still have a relationship. You may not have to be that close, but you could still have a decent relationship. But I think what happens in our culture, at least very individualistic cultures, is there's this complete cutoff. And I feel like it's easier to do when it's something that you grew up doing and you don't know any other way of operating. When you start to then form a relationship, when these young people grow up and they try to develop their own relationships, they're going to be attracted to relationships that feel comfortable to them. It'll feel like a normal thing, but then when they realize how abusive it is when they become alienated from their own children, then it's a double whammy at that point because they realize they were alienated and now they're being alienated again. So that's the intergenerational component to it. I don't know the exact prevalence of it. I do know from my research, when I've done qualitative research, I'd say over half of people I've interviewed say that it happened to them. And they didn't realize it till they were older and had their own children. But I can't generalize that to everybody because it wasn't a representative sample. But I do know anecdotally, a lot of people talk about that they didn't know until they were much older and had their own children, and it was happening again. I think that's probably the most important part as a parent is you want to be healthy for when they come back around. And it's hard to stay healthy when you've experienced that kind of loss. But if they do, and if there's an opening to come back, you want to be in a place where you could receive them and not be bitter. Don't talk to them about what happened. They don't want to talk about it. If they do, just tell them the door's open. They'll come and I'm happy to answer any questions you have to give you my perspective on it. Not to tell you the truth. Don't tell kids that. Then they'll defend the alienator. Say, when you're ready, I'm happy to share that with you. But they may never ask you. And if you feel compelled to try to explain yourself to your child, don't do it because you're only doing that for yourself. You want to do what they're ready to hear from you on what happened and, your perspective. And know that it's not an easy thing. Even when children leave a cult or when adults leave a cult, they don't just leave. They often go back several times. So it's not always an immediate, I'm out and I'm safe. So I think a lot of parents, they get hopeful when their kids come back to them and then why did they go back? It's a natural part of, they're trying to separate and it's not a clean break. The web in which they're tied to their abuser is very strong and getting them out of it. There's a lot of guilt. There's a lot of shame wrapped up there and children can't contain that. It's hard enough for an adult to contain that kind of feeling. Children don't have the capacity to know how to do it and nobody's modeling for them how to do it. So unless they have really good therapist who knows how to deal with those feelings, that kid's on their own because the abuser doesn't know how to do it, and they're often not able to even be present to care. So it's important to understand that it's a process to get them out, and it won't be likely an overnight thing. If they don't come back, just understand why. But if you're in the best place you can be to receive them, you need to deal with your own trauma about it, because how you're going to hold their trauma, how are you going to be the safe place for them to process that trauma? You need to be that for them. They're going to look for alerts all the time. So even though they might be reconnecting with you, understand that they have internalized this very negative attitude towards you. And they're going to look for any signs that might tell them that what they're doing is wrong. Because they're not trusting their gut at this point. They're like, okay, I don't trust what my alienating parent is telling me. I might try to reconcile with my other parent to see if what they're telling me is true, or they want to verify it maybe. And their hackles are up. They're making sure that, it's kind of like a animal coming out of a hole trying to kind of see if it's safe, right? That's probably the best analogy. And any little thing could scare them. I mean, not that you want to walk on eggshells. You don't want to do that either. You want to be as genuine as you can. But in order to be genuine and be able to hold your child's emotions when they do this, you need to be in the best place you can be. Otherwise, you won't be able to receive them very well. Unfortunately, the parents that do that are not going to hear anything I would have to say. They would. I'm considered and labeled some extremist, which I'm not. They labeled me that way because it feels too discrepant from their reality, and their reality is a real one, right? It's a distorted personality disorder usually in those severe cases. So I don't think anything I would actually ever have to say would actually get through to them. They would just say I'm defending an abuser, because in their mind they believe that they're the victims and that all the behaviors that they're doing are just to protect the child. Even though, I just published a paper with my grad student, Hassam Baravi, where a representative sample of parents rated even one alienating behavior as being abusive. So even the general public sees that these behaviors are abusive, but that person will never see it. I don't care how much you point it out to them, the damage it does, they don't feel it's justified. It's a means to an end in their mind of what they're doing to their child. And they're not always thinking through how it affects them, because in their mind, that's the lesser problem. The other parent for them is the bigger problem, and they're willing to overlook the impact it has on their child. I think milder cases, people are more receptive to it. So for the programs, for example, for mild and moderate cases of alienation, focus more. Those parents are usually more open-minded. So there's less pathology, so there's more room for improvement. But I know most of you all probably watching this are in the more severe camp, where I don't think there's much you could say. If it was a professional, I might just say, you might want to update your reading on the research of parental alienation. And maybe attend some conferences like this one to get yourself educated, because most of what we know has been published since, over the last decade. And most people of these professionals have been out of grad school for 20 something years. They probably haven't read a lot. I think right now also there's advances in science and other things that are making it easier to access research. So people don't have the excuse anymore of saying it's behind a paywall, I can't get it, I can't read it. So they can't use that as an excuse to not be up to date. And it's unethical to not be up to date on research. All practitioners have to get continuing ed credits. They need to stay on top of the research. Otherwise, they are practicing unethical. So if you have an expert up there, or alleged expert up there, talking about research from 20 years ago, and they're not talking about anything recent, that's unethical. And your lawyers need to call them out on that. This is why mediation doesn't work in alienation cases. Domestic violence advocates have been arguing this for a long time. They say it's actually more abusive to subject a victim of domestic violence, coercive controlling abuse, to sit in mediation, because the abuser is just using it to stall. They're using it to further get information to abuse even more. And that's intentional on the part of the abusive parent.
Right. It's intentional,
strategic. I mean, these are abusive parents. They're just happy to use the kids. That's why it's an alienation. But it's the same. We're not any different than what some of these domestic violence folks are talking about. We just happen to recognize it could be moms doing it too. That's the only difference. And we recognize that the children could be used as weapons. We recognize that. They recognize it, but they seem to only think it happens whenever dad makes them a weapon, not when mom makes them a weapon.
Before seeing research like yours and some of your colleagues, you're just in a maze trying to make understanding of all of this. And without that understanding, it's torture. But once you have that, the first step to healing is understanding what all this is happening. So it is immensely powerful just for us, even if we can't save our kids, to have that understanding so we can heal ourselves, right? And it is helping society because while it might be slow, I see changes happening, so it's powerful. Thank you.
It's very powerful.
I just want to offer a great big thanks in every way for the work that you've done and just be blessed for everything that you've put out there. Thank you.